Hello and welcome to the second lecture of this course. We're going to learn how to set up Windows Subsystem for Linux. Windows Subsystem for Linux allows Windows users to install a Linux environment without the overhead of using something called a virtual machine. If you've had any experience in the past setting up things like VirtualBox or VMware or things of this nature, it's kind of a pain to set up a Windows machine to use a Linux distro. So there's two different ways to enable this feature in Windows. We're just going to go over the most common way that people will in this next section. Installation of the actual distribution, so the thing that we're going to be using, which is Debian in this course, it will be done via the Microsoft Store. And all of that will be shown here shortly. So a brief history of Unix/Linux is Linux was first released in 1991. This was a personal project by a person named Linus. Their goal was to create a new and free operating system using the existing code base for Unix operating system kernel. So the Linux kernel is primarily written in C. Unix can be thought of as a parent of Linux, and nowadays there's so many different versions of Linux. Really, they're very much similar. So I think that Debian is probably one of the easier ones to get used to, and that's why I chose it for this course. So Unix was released in 1970. It was later rewritten in C by Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie. So Dennis Ritchie and Brian Carrion were the two creators of the C language. So it was highly likely that they were trying to seek out something easier to write in than the tools or languages they were using at the time. So let's go ahead and start setting up our Linux environment. Okay, now in order to set up Windows Subsystem for Linux, we're going to go ahead and go to our desktop, and I like to type in or hit the Windows key and then start typing enable Windows features. And you can get to this through the control panel, but I find this shortcut a lot easier. So we're going to go ahead and click on this. It's going to pop up this features window. We can go ahead and expand this. And typically there's going to be a box here that says Windows Subsystem for Linux. You're going to go ahead and check that and click OK. And it's going to enable and probably install some things on there for you. And it will probably ask you to reboot as well. So I've already done this. I didn't have to go through this process. I'm not going to go through this process on this recording, but just know that you will probably have to reboot after installing this. So go ahead and click close. And the next part we're going to do after you reboot and come back, you're going to go ahead and hit the Windows key and you're going to type Windows Store. And we're going to go ahead and go to the Windows Store, and inside of here we're going to type in Debian, and it will list it as an application. We'll go ahead and click on it, and this button will say install. And now once that's installed, you have to, just like I said before, when you install the Windows Subsystem for Linux, it will prompt you to restart. If you do not restart and you install Debian, you'll run into some installation issues just through trying to launch Debian. So please make sure you restart. Now, after you've restarted from enabling Windows Subsystem for Linux and then installing Debian, you should now have the ability to launch Debian. So we can go ahead and hit the Windows key again and type Debian and launch our command line interface. So now you know you have it successfully installed, and we're going to move on to installing Visual Studio Code. Okay, once we have Windows Subsystem for Linux set up and Debian set up, we're going to go ahead and install our code editor. And for this course, I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code because it's the easiest thing to use for beginners, in my opinion. So I'm going to go here and type Visual Studio Code. And the first link is typically what you're going to want, Visual Studio Code. And at this current iteration, depending on whether you're on Mac, Linux, or Windows, the site may look a little different, and this download button will be a little different. So you'd go ahead and go through everything and install, and you will eventually be able to launch Visual Studio Code. So Visual Studio Code looks something along these lines. And there's a few things that we're going to need to set up inside of Visual Studio Code. One is we need to install some extensions that make working in Visual Studio Code a little bit easier. So for one, we can click on here, Extensions, and you're going to want this one at the very top that I have enabled, but you'll have to search, which is C/C++. Right, so this one is pretty useful to have. I would recommend installing it, and should make things a little bit easier. So for now, that one will do. The other thing that we need to do is get kind of familiar with some of the shortcuts that are inside of Visual Studio Code. So for one, there's a command mode that you can enter in. I believe to get into command mode, it's Control-Shift-P on Windows. This will vary depending on which platform you're using, but since I'm using Windows, I'm just going to be saying Windows key bindings. So something I can do is open a new external terminal, which will do exactly what it says, and that's not really what we need because we need to actually open up a terminal window that's using Linux. So by default, usually it's PowerShell. So what we're going to do is there's actually a terminal option up here. We're going to click on that. We're going to click New Terminal. And if you see up here, there's actually a binding in Windows for Control-Shift and then the tick mark. So we click on that. And by default, you see that it shows up as a CMD prompt. And that's not what I want. So there's a drop-down box, and I can go ahead and select default shell. And I want to select our WSL bash. Now, once I select that, a new bash should be selected here when I click the plus button. So again, we were here. In order to select a default shell, we clicked on select default shell. We selected our WSL bash, and then we clicked the plus sign. Now in here, you can go ahead and clean some stuff up. So we're not going to use this one. We're not going to use 2 of those. We only need 1. So this is actually the same thing as launching Debian here, except it's actually currently inside of the folder that I have open in Visual Studio Code, which is a little bit different segment. You can mess around with the code editor and figure out some of the neat features that it has, but for now, this is basically all we want to be doing. Okay, so now after you get Visual Studio Code installed, let's go ahead and update all of our dependencies and applications that we're probably going to be using for the remainder of the course in our Linux machine. Now that we set up Windows Subsystem for Linux and our code editor, let's go ahead and update our Debian installation by hitting the Windows key, go ahead and typing Debian. And what we're going to need first is to update our current packages on this machine. So we can go ahead and type sudo apt update, enter, and it's going to ask for our password that we set up before. So just make sure I type this right. And it tells me that all packages are updated. You will probably more than likely not get that message. So what I did there is I just cleared the terminal to give me a fresh screen. So after we've updated the packages, what we need to do is install them by typing sudo apt upgrade -y. And typically, like I said, if you have a bunch of stuff that you need to update or upgrade, this would happen here. Now, there's a few other things that we will need to install, but we're going to go ahead and wait until we actually need those things, and then we will install them. So thanks for watching these lectures, and hope to see you in the next one.